In the sultry heart of Louisiana in 1856, where magnolia trees perfumed the thick summer air and the Mississippi River moved slow and heavy with secrets, there stood a plantation whose beauty concealed a horror that would eventually consume three of Louisiana's most prominent families. The Beaumont estate, with its antebellum mansion and carefully manicured gardens, was known throughout New Orleans society as a model of Southern elegance and propriety. What no one suspected was that beneath the mansion's gleaming floors, in a cellar that appeared on no architectural plans, a young woman was keeping a man prisoner for purposes she believed to be love. In the spring of 1859, when authorities finally forced entry into that hidden room, they discovered something that defied their understanding of human behavior and challenged every assumption about the gentility of the Southern belle. This is the story of Caroline Beaumont, a girl who confused desire with ownership and obsession with devotion, and the slave who survived 3 years of captivity only to have his testimony buried by the same society that had failed to protect him. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history locked away in cellars of its own. The Beaumont plantation sat on 2,400 acres of prime Louisiana bottomland, its fields producing sugarcane that supplied refineries throughout New Orleans and generated the enormous wealth that sustained the family's extravagant lifestyle. The main house was a masterpiece of Greek Revival architecture, built in 1835 by Caroline's grandfather with materials imported from Europe and enslaved craftsmen whose skills rivaled any free artisan. 3 stories of white columns, wrap-around galleries, and interior rooms designed for elaborate entertaining. It was precisely the kind of home that defined Southern aristocracy in the decades before the Civil War. Caroline Beaumont was born in 1837, the only daughter of Augustus and Marguerite Beaumont, plantation owners who embodied the ideal of refined Southern culture. She grew up surrounded by slaves who attended to her every need, tutors who educated her in arts and literature, and a social circle that reinforced her position at the apex of Louisiana's rigid hierarchy. At 16, she was sent to Madame Rousseau's finishing school in Charleston, an institution that promised to transform wealthy daughters into perfect specimens of Southern womanhood, skilled in music, conversational arts, household management, and the delicate social performances that defined their class. Caroline excelled at Madame Rousseau's, particularly in subjects that allowed her to indulge what her instructors termed her passionate nature. She threw herself into piano with an intensity that sometimes alarmed her teachers, practicing for hours beyond assigned lessons until her fingers bled. Her French conversation was flawless, but delivered with an emotional intensity that made even innocuous subjects sound dramatic. In literature classes, she favored romantic novels featuring doomed love affairs and tragic heroines, copying entire passages into personal journals she kept locked in her dormitory room. During her 3 years at Madame Rousseau's, Caroline developed ideas about love and possession that would have horrified her instructors had they known. She read forbidden novels, Gothic tales of obsession and captivity, stories where love justified any action and desire transcended morality. She formed intense attachments to schoolmates that other girls found unsettling, possessive friendships that demanded exclusive attention and became melodramatic when their objects showed interest in others. By the time she returned to Louisiana in the spring of 1856, Caroline had constructed an elaborate internal world where passion was virtue, where wanting something badly enough justified obtaining it by any means, and where the line between love and ownership had dissolved entirely. The object of Caroline's obsession was waiting for her at home, though he didn't yet know the role he would be forced to play. His name was Marcus, and at 24 years old, he was the Beaumont plantation's most valued house slave. Marcus had been born on the property, his mother a seamstress and his father the head coachman. From childhood, he had shown unusual intelligence and was trained for house service rather than field labor. He spoke well, carried himself with dignity that some visitors found almost unsettling in a slave, and had been taught to read by the Beaumont's previous tutor, an abolitionist sympathizer who believed literacy was a natural right, regardless of race or status. Augustus Beaumont had discovered the unauthorized lessons and dismissed the tutor, but allowed Marcus to retain his literacy, finding it useful to have a slave who could inventory supplies and keep household records. By 1856, Marcus was indispensable to the plantation's operation, managing the main house staff, coordinating with overseers about household needs, and serving as his master's personal valet during business trips to New Orleans. Marcus was, in the calculus of slavery, successful, trusted enough to move relatively freely, respected by other slaves for his position, and seemingly secure in his role. What he couldn't have anticipated was that these very qualities, intelligence, dignity, physical attractiveness, would make him the focus of an obsession that would destroy the relative stability of his life. Caroline noticed Marcus during her first week home from Charleston. He was serving dinner, moving through the dining room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times. But something in his bearing caught her attention. Perhaps the way he held himself, the careful control in his movements, or simply that he was present at a moment when Caroline was primed to project her romantic fantasies onto any suitable object. Over the following weeks, she began engineering opportunities to interact with him, requesting his help with tasks that other slaves could easily perform, asking him to bring items to her room, to move furniture, to run errands that kept him near the main house where she could observe him. Marcus noticed Caroline's attention and tried to avoid it. He had lived 24 years as a slave and understood that nothing good came from attracting excessive notice from masters, particularly young unmarried mistresses whose interest could be easily misread or weaponized by jealous family members. He performed his duties but tried to maintain professional distance, a nearly impossible task given that Caroline had virtually unlimited power to summon him whenever she chose. By summer of 1856, Caroline's interest had evolved into something much darker. She began keeping detailed journals about Marcus, describing his appearance in language borrowed from the romantic novels she had read at Madame Rousseau's. She wrote about his hands, strong and capable, about his voice, deep and measured, about the way sunlight caught his features when he worked in the gardens. She convinced herself that what she felt was love, pure and transcendent, something that slavery's arbitrary rules couldn't diminish. In her increasingly disturbed reasoning, the fact that Marcus was her family's property made their connection even more special, more authentically theirs, because it existed outside conventional social structures. In August 1856, Caroline made her first explicit move. She summoned Marcus to her bedroom late at night, claiming she needed help moving a heavy trunk. When he arrived, carefully leaving the door open as protocol required, she closed it and told him directly that she had feelings for him, that she believed he felt the same way, and that they could create something beautiful together despite the circumstances. Marcus responded with desperate diplomacy, thanking her for her kindness, but explaining that any relationship between them was impossible, that he was engaged in the slave quarters to a woman named Sarah, and that pursuing such an association would endanger them both. Caroline's response was a mixture of tears, rage, and promises. She insisted that his engagement was meaningless, that Sarah couldn't possibly understand him the way she did, that social conventions about race and status were merely obstacles to be overcome. When Marcus tried to leave, she grabbed his arm and said something that would echo through the following years. She said that if he couldn't choose to be with her willingly, she would find other ways to ensure they could be together. Marcus reported the encounter to his mother the next morning, his hands shaking as he described what had happened. His mother, who had witnessed 40 years of plantation life, immediately understood the danger. She advised Marcus to request field assignment, to remove himself from the main house and from Caroline's reach. Marcus approached Augustus Beaumont that afternoon with a carefully constructed story about wanting to learn agricultural management to eventually serve as an overseer. Augustus, who valued Marcus precisely because of his house skills, refused the request and told Marcus that he was needed where he was. End of discussion. Caroline, overhearing this exchange from an adjoining room, smiled to herself, understanding that her father had inadvertently ensured Marcus would remain accessible to her. Over the following months, Caroline's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would summon Marcus multiple times a day for trivial tasks, then dismiss him angrily when he maintained professional distance. She began following him around the plantation, appearing wherever he worked, watching him with an intensity that other slaves found disturbing. She started asking Marcus's mother questions about his childhood, his preferences, his daily routines, gathering information with the methodical focus of someone planning something significant. In December 1856, Caroline discovered something that would enable her obsession to take physical form. While exploring the mansion's cellars with Marcus, who had been ordered to help her search for Christmas decorations stored in basement rooms, she found a space that didn't appear on any floor plans. Behind a false wall in the wine cellar, accessible only through a hidden door, was a room approximately 10 feet square that had apparently been used for storage decades earlier and then forgotten. The room had no windows, no ventilation except what came through cracks in the foundation, and most importantly, no access except through the concealed entrance. To Caroline's disturbed mind, the room represented possibility, a private space where she could finally have Marcus entirely to herself, away from social conventions, family interference, and his own resistance to her affection. She began planning immediately with the same intensity she had brought to piano practice at Madame Rousseau's. She ordered supplies through intermediaries, claiming she was creating a private study space, a place where a young lady could pursue hobbies away from family observation. She had a carpenter, who was not a plantation slave, and thus had no knowledge of the mansion's layout, construct a sturdy bed frame that she claimed was for a guest room. She purchased locks from a New Orleans merchant, saying they were for trunks containing valuable jewelry. She assembled blankets, basic furniture, chamber pots, and other necessities, all acquired separately and moved to the hidden room over several weeks, each item innocuous by itself but collectively forming the infrastructure of a prison. Marcus knew nothing of these preparations until the night of January 15, 1857, when Caroline summoned him to the wine cellar, claiming that several bottles had broken and she needed help cleaning the mess before her father discovered it. When Marcus arrived, Caroline was waiting with something she had obtained from the plantation's medical supplies, a dose of laudanum strong enough to render him unconscious. She had mixed it with wine and offered it to him as thanks for helping at such a late hour. Marcus, tired from a long day and not suspecting anything from a glass of wine, drank it without question. He woke hours later in the hidden room, his head throbbing from the drug, his hands and feet bound with rope that Caroline had carefully knotted while he was unconscious. The door was locked from the outside, and Caroline was sitting in a chair watching him with an expression he would never forget, a mixture of satisfaction, nervousness, and something that might have been mistaken for affection if the context had been different. She explained calmly that she had brought him here because she loved him, because they needed time together away from the world's judgment, because this was the only way they could truly be together. She'd promised that if he accepted her love willingly, if he stopped resisting what she insisted was mutual attraction, he would be treated well and eventually allowed more freedom. But if he continued to reject her, well, she controlled everything in this room, including whether he ate, whether he had light, whether he survived. Marcus tried reasoning with her, explaining that what she was doing was kidnapping, that his absence would be noticed, that her family would search for him. Caroline laughed, a sound that Marcus would later describe as one of the most chilling things he ever heard, and explained that she had already handled those concerns. Earlier that evening she had told her parents that Marcus had expressed interest in visiting a sick relative on a neighboring plantation, and had been given permission to be away for a few days. When those days passed, she would report that Marcus had apparently run away, a not uncommon occurrence that would be treated as theft of property rather than a mystery requiring investigation. Augustus Beaumont might send slave catchers to search, but Caroline would ensure the search focused on directions away from the plantation, and eventually, the matter would be dropped as an unfortunate loss. And so began Marcus's captivity. 3 years and 2 months in a 10 by 10-foot room, completely dependent on a woman who believed imprisonment was love and control was devotion. Caroline's routine was meticulous and revealed both her disturbed psychology and her careful planning. She visited Marcus 3 times a day, bringing food, water, and other necessities, but always timing her visits when the main house was otherwise occupied and no one would notice her repeated trips to the cellar. She brought books, insisting they read together, though Marcus often refused to participate. She brought her piano compositions written out on paper, playing them from memory and demanding his opinion, becoming angry when he remained silent. She talked for hours about her life, her time at Madame Rousseau's, her frustrations with society's expectations, her conviction that what she felt for Marcus transcended normal relationships. In her deeply disturbed reasoning, the room wasn't a prison but a sanctuary, a place where they could be authentic without the world's interference. Marcus resisted initially, refusing to speak to her, turning away when she entered, maintaining silent dignity in the face of captivity. Caroline responded by withholding food for days at a time, by removing his blankets during winter cold, by sitting in the room's only chair for hours, refusing to leave until he acknowledged her. The psychological warfare was systematic and devastating. Marcus learned that resistance brought suffering, that the only way to ensure basic survival was to perform some minimal version of the relationship Caroline demanded. He learned to respond when she spoke, to feign interest in her compositions, to sit near her when she insisted on physical proximity. These coerced performances were never enough for Caroline, who wanted genuine affection but would settle for increasingly convincing imitations of it. The physical conditions of Marcus's imprisonment were deliberately maintained at a level that kept him weak enough to control, but alive enough to continue serving as the object of Caroline's obsession. The room was cold in winter and stifling in summer, its lack of ventilation creating air that was thick and stale. Marcus developed chronic respiratory problems from the poor air quality, a cough that never quite went away and would ultimately cause permanent lung damage. He lost weight steadily, Caroline's food provisions being just sufficient to prevent starvation but never enough for health. His skin took on a pallor that came from complete absence of sunlight, his eyes becoming sensitive to even the dim lamplight Caroline brought during her visits. But perhaps the worst aspect of Marcus's captivity was the psychological isolation. He had no contact with anyone except Caroline for more than 3 years. No knowledge of what was happening in the world outside the room, no way to mark time except through Caroline's visits, and the few clues those visits provided about seasons and passing months. He tried to maintain his sanity through mental exercises, reciting poetry he had memorized before captivity, conducting mathematical calculations in his head, creating elaborate stories about people and places from his memories. But the isolation gradually eroded these efforts, and Marcus found himself losing track of narratives, forgetting sequences of events, struggling to maintain coherent thoughts. Caroline interpreted his deterioration as progress, believing that his increasing docility and occasional willingness to engage in conversation signified growing affection. She never understood or refused to understand that what she was witnessing was trauma response, the psychological adaptations of someone whose survival depended on pleasing his captor. She continued her diary entries, writing about their relationship as if it were a conventional romance, describing conversations that had actually been coerced performances, interpreting Marcus's compliance as evidence that he was finally accepting his feelings for her. In the world above the hidden room, Marcus's disappearance was handled exactly as Caroline had predicted. Augustus Beaumont was angry about losing a valuable slave and sent slave catchers to search neighboring parishes, but after several weeks with no leads, he wrote the loss off as a financial matter and moved on. Marcus's mother and fiancée Sarah knew something was wrong. A trusted slave like Marcus wouldn't simply run away, but they had no way to investigate and no one who would listen to their concerns. In the slave quarters, speculation circulated that Marcus had been sold away secretly, possibly as punishment for some unknown offense. A not uncommon practice when masters wanted to remove problematic slaves without admitting to disciplinary issues. 2 years into Marcus's captivity, Caroline's behavior above ground began showing strain. She had lost interest in social events, preferring to spend time at home where she could maintain her visitation schedule. She became short-tempered with family and servants, particularly when interrupted during her self-scheduled times in the cellar. She stopped playing piano in the main house music room, claiming she preferred to practice privately, though the house staff never heard piano music from her room. Marguerite Beaumont noticed her daughter's changes and worried that Caroline was becoming depressed or ill, possibly suffering from the melancholy that supposedly afflicted sensitive young women. She suggested Caroline visit New Orleans, spend time with cousins, perhaps consider courtship with appropriate young men from their social circle. Caroline refused all suggestions, insisting she was perfectly content at home and needed no outside entertainment. In the spring of 1859, events began moving toward Discovery, a visiting contractor, brought to the plantation to repair damage from winter storms, was examining the mansion's foundation and noticed discrepancies between the cellar's apparent size and the building's exterior dimensions. He mentioned to Augustus Beaumont that there appeared to be a space unaccounted for, possibly a room that had been walled off, and offered to investigate to ensure there was no structural damage. Augustus, curious about his own home's mysteries, agreed. Caroline overheard this conversation and understood immediately that discovery was imminent. She made a desperate decision. She would claim that she had found Marcus injured on the property months ago, that she had hidden him in the room to nurse him secretly, that her actions, while unconventional, had been motivated by Christian charity. It was a ridiculous story that wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny, but Caroline had convinced herself over 3 years that her motivations were pure, and in her disturbed state, she believed others would see her actions as she saw them, evidence of deep love rather than criminal captivity. When the contractor opened the hidden room on April 3, 1859, he found Marcus in a condition that horrified everyone present. Emaciated, weak, his skin pale and his eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden light. Marcus could barely stand without support. The room smelled of human waste, illness, and long confinement. The contractor, Augustus Beaumont, and 2 overseers who had accompanied them stood frozen, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. Marcus, barely able to speak above a whisper, managed to say Caroline's name, and in that moment, everyone understood who was responsible. Caroline was in the room within minutes, having heard the commotion. She tried to explain, starting with her prepared story about finding Marcus injured, but her father cut her off, his face rigid with a mixture of rage and horror. He ordered Caroline to her room under guard and had Marcus carried to the slave quarters, where his mother collapsed upon seeing her son's condition. A doctor was summoned and spent 3 hours examining Marcus, documenting malnutrition, respiratory damage, signs of prolonged captivity, and psychological trauma that the doctor, despite limited understanding of mental health, recognized as severe and possibly permanent. The doctor's report left no doubt that Marcus had been deliberately imprisoned for an extended period. Augustus Beaumont faced an impossible situation. His daughter had committed a crime that, if publicly known, would destroy the family's reputation and likely result in Caroline being institutionalized in an asylum. But addressing the crime meant acknowledging it had occurred, meant explaining to New Orleans society why their daughter had imprisoned a slave for 3 years, meant accepting that their family had produced someone capable of such disturbed behavior. The solution, arrived at through consultations with family lawyers and the 2 other prominent families who needed to protect their associations with the Beaumonts, was silence. Marcus would be told he was being freed and given money to leave Louisiana, with the understanding that speaking publicly about what had happened would result in legal action against him under various pretexts. Caroline would be quietly sent to a private sanatorium in Virginia, her departure explained as a health retreat. The contractor and the doctor would be paid substantial sums to forget what they had seen. their silence ensured through a combination of financial incentive and social pressure, from families who couldn't afford to have their connections to the Beaumonts tainted by scandal. And so the crime that should have resulted in prosecution instead resulted in concealment, privileged society protecting its own by erasing evidence and silencing witnesses. Marcus was given his freedom papers and 200, a sum that would last perhaps 6 months if used carefully. He left Louisiana in late April 1859, taking with him permanent lung damage, psychological trauma that made sustained social interaction nearly impossible, and the knowledge that justice for what Caroline had done to him would never come. He eventually settled in Ohio, working odd jobs and living in near isolation, his 3 years in the hidden room having stripped away his ability to trust others or engage in normal relationships. He never married, never spoke publicly about his captivity, and died in 1892, his obituary noting only that he had been born enslaved in Louisiana and had lived quietly in Cincinnati for 3 decades. Caroline spent 4 years at the Virginia Sanatorium, diagnosed with hysteria and treated with methods that were likely as traumatic as they were ineffective. She returned to Louisiana in 1863, finding her family's plantation struggling under the disruptions of the Civil War. She lived through Reconstruction as a recluse, rarely leaving the main house, tended by freed servants who knew her history and watched her with mixture of pity and revulsion. She died in 1889 at the age of 52, her later years marked by increasing mental deterioration that asylum doctors attributed to the same hysterical condition they had diagnosed decades earlier. Her obituary in New Orleans papers described her as a tragic figure, a delicate belle broken by the war's hardships, making no mention of the hidden room or the man she had imprisoned there. The Beaumont mansion stood until 1920, when it was demolished by developers who found maintaining the aging structure economically unfeasible. The hidden room was discovered during demolition, and local newspapers printed brief stories about the mysterious cellar space, speculating it might have been used for storing valuables or hiding family members during the Civil War. No mention was made of its true history, that information having been successfully buried by families who valued reputation over truth. Today, the site of the Beaumont plantation is a commercial district in suburban New Orleans, and few residents know that beneath their shops and parking lots once stood a mansion containing a room where a woman imprisoned a man for 3 years under the delusion that captivity was love. But the story persists in archives, in scattered documents that escaped family destruction efforts. In the Freedom Papers Marcus carried to Ohio that listed his owner as Caroline Beaumont and his liberation date as April 1859. And in those fragments, we find one of slavery's most disturbing truths, that the system that gave humans absolute power over other humans enabled not just economic exploitation and casual cruelty, but also the kind of obsessive, logical behavior that arose when ownership was confused with intimacy and control was mistaken for devotion. If this story revealed something you never knew about the hidden horrors of plantation life, leave a comment telling us what disturbed you most. And if you want more untold stories of America's darkest chapters, subscribe now. These stories matter not just as history, but as reminders that systems permitting absolute power over human beings will always produce horrors that societies then work desperately to forget. That those with privilege and status can purchase silence, even for the most egregious crimes. And that the only protection against such atrocities is refusing to grant anyone absolute power over another human being. Some believe Caroline Beaumont was mentally ill, that her actions reflected pathology rather than moral failure, and that she deserves sympathy as much as condemnation. Others insist she was simply a product of her class and time, taught from birth that slaves existed for masters' use, and that her wants naturally superseded their rights to autonomy or safety. What is certain is that for 3 years and 2 months, a man lived in complete captivity because a woman with absolute power over him decided that her desire justified his imprisonment, and that when the truth finally emerged, the same society that had enabled her crime worked efficiently to ensure it would be forgotten rather than addressed.